The power of the switch.
Yeah. Welcome to the Financial Policy Working Group. It's our agenda for June 11th, 2024. This committee hasn't met in a couple of years, so we're going to organize the committee, have discussion about the role of the committee and the process that we'll use. We'll review the current financial policy for any changes, and then we'll set our next meeting and adjourn for the night. This committee was set up, geez, it's,
2006.
yeah, again, it's been a while. And the Finance Committee, I think it was Mark, okay. Finance Committee was the impetus behind setting this committee up. And it's been the chair of the Finance Committee that is the chair of this committee. I don't think we've ever had a vice chair or other officers for this committee. I'll leave it open for discussion whether you think we should. I probably should, in case I'm not around for one meeting. We should have a vice chair. Discussions? No?
Probably makes
Good.
sense.
Yep.
Doesn't hurt to have one.
Any volunteers?
I nominate Fred.
Second.
Okay. You better be
There's a
here.
motion and a second for Fred as vice chair. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
It's
Just
unanimous.
so it's not
Thank you very much,
unanimous,
Fred. So I said that the role of the committee, in the policy itself, it says that the Finance Committee and the Select Board should review and vote this policy annually, even if there's no changes to the policy. That's something that we haven't been faithful with for quite a while. I know we last made changes to this policy back in 2018, and I'm not certain that it's gone to either committee for a vote since then. So we should, when we get to that section, we should decide what we want to do. Do we want to keep it annually? Do we want to make it every 3 years? Do you want to do it just when there's changes? That's something we can discuss. Right now, there's nothing in the policy that we have a school committee member here. And the rationale behind having a school committee person here is you control half of the town's budget, 24% of the $24 million of our budget. You should be aware of the things that we're trying to accomplish financially within the town. There's nothing in here that's asking for the school committee to approve the policy, but if we add something in there for the school department, then we certainly would want the school committee to approve the policy.
Makes sense to
I
me.
have some things towards the back that I'd like to discuss about adding for the schools. So once we go through the policy and we come to an agreement for changes that we would like to see, it then goes to the full boards for approval. Right now, just Select Board and Finance Committee, and we can talk about the school committee after that. And then once those boards approve it, then it's written in stone, and that's what we go by for the next budget year. So I thought this was a good time to get the group back together. The budget's still fresh in our minds. What we went through to get to where we are, the things that we talked about during the budget process. So, and again, as we go through this, if there's anything that people are fuzzy about, they don't truly understand, let's talk about it so everybody knows exactly what is meant by what's in this policy, because it's, as it says in this policy, it's something that, the policy itself is something that governs. It's going to last boards, turnover on boards. I mean, just think of all the people that have been on the Select Board and all the people who have been on FinCom and School Committee since we put this policy in place back in early 2000s. So there's been a lot of turnover in these boards, and one thing that's been constant is this policy. And we've been able to keep pretty good financial sense going forward with our AAA bond rating for the past 10 years. And this policy helps us maintain that. Right? Again, I'll leave it open for the group, how you want to handle this. I've gone through it, and I've done a red line version of this copy here of just changes that I think. I'm not saying that this is written in stone, it's just my opinions as people go through it. If you have other changes, we should discuss it, and we should discuss anything that I put in here as changes also. Given that, do we want to just go through each section and discuss each section, or just hit the sections that have changes? What's the pleasure of the group?
I think changes.
Changes?
I mean, that makes sense to me, where the intent is to meet again, right?
Mhm.
So we can always,
Revisit.
based upon tonight's conversation, revisit other topics, but to make best use of our time tonight, why don't we run through
Okay.
proposed changes?
Right, so we have my suggestions in front of us as we get to the section. If anybody else had anything that they found in those sections, please bring it up, and we can talk about it. One of the first things is, of course, changing Board of Selectmen references to Select Board, so that's all over the place in these things. So the first kind of change I had was in Section 3 in the overview, number 3. Besides having the finance director give projections on stabilization, capital stabilization, OPEB, I added pension also. Something that we've been doing over the past few years, whereas the budget's put together, we know what those amounts are going to be. We know what the extra amounts that we're going to pay out of free cash to our liabilities is going to be. And so that's something that
So
Ryan would
this is
come
just
up with.
codifying present practice.
Present practice.
Okay.
As you remember, the last time we looked at this in 18, the thing that we were really focused on was OPEB.
Mhm.
And now that we're getting closer to being at the arc with OPEB, our focus should then shift over to pension so we can get that liability down. That makes sense to everyone? Is that okay? Right.
What's the OPEB acronym stand for?
Other post-employment
Benefits.
benefits,
Okay.
yeah.
So it's making sure that the town has the finances available to pay the health insurance costs for retirees.
Okay.
And that's town and school employees. So that's everybody. Okay. Section 5, I just changed again the title.
So should we stop you if we have questions?
Absolutely.
All right. So, in reviewing the goals,
Mhm.
I think the language in number 3 should be consistent with the language in number 5. So we talk about maintaining proper levels of quality service, but we don't talk about maintenance and improvement. I think that how we treat our infrastructure and other assets should be fairly consistent with how we treat our services.
Okay. Do you want to see like 3 and 5 combined, or just add language?
No, I
to
just think
number
we
5?
we should mirror the language. I liked the language in 5, maintaining and improving. So I think that language so maintaining and improving the levels of service. I also was hoping that number 4, adequate reserve levels. And in some places we define those. So
Yeah.
do we want to say as defined in this policy?
Sure. We can I know there's a lot of places in there we actually call out the section where it's in, so we can either do that or just say as defined, as seen or defined later in this document. Okay.
And then number 7, I kind of questioned in its whole. I'm not sure that our goal is to minimize costs and maximize revenues. Because if that were the case, we'd be taxing everybody to the fullest extent we possibly can
We do.
You do,
without,
override.
right, but we
That would
don't.
include fees as well. I get your point.
Yeah, it includes fees, it would include cutting out all our abatements and the senior tax work-off program, and minimizing cost of government.
Maybe you want to be specific about it, Steve, in terms of up to the tax levy. You know, that's, what Karen's saying is right, she's got a good point. But then we want to be more specific about when we say we're we're taxing up to the highest level, what specifically we mean by that. What number is that, Karen?
7.
7, okay. Yeah, because
So what language would you like to see there, Karen?
I'm not sure that,
Or any.
Yeah.
That's right.
I would strike it
Strike it?
personally.
Okay.
That's fine. One of the things that as we go through this,
I liked the piece about minimizing the cost of the government. I mean, that should be a goal or priority. We all of the boards act like, stewards of the money and spend wisely and all that good stuff, but I think you had an issue more about the spirit of maximizing revenues, right?
Well, no, I mean, I have an issue with minimizing the costs as well. I mean, I can think of all sorts of ways that we can minimize the costs that in unacceptable ways.
Perhaps we should use
To,
the language
you know,
more like
it's a
efficient
pol-
manner in 3.
That reads more like an economic policy to me than a financial management policy.
Yeah, so section 3 says proper level quality services in the most cost efficient manner. Maybe we want the government to be run in a cost efficient
Cost-efficient
manner. Something like
so
that.
taking 7 out and just keeping 3 there kind of gets to your point.
I suppose
It
it
does.
does.
That's fine. Like I was going to say, as you go through this and you see some of the language, you have to realize the time when this document was probably put into place, and some of that language it was a different time, we were in a different position financially, so minimizing expenses with some of the philosophy that was prevalent back in the early 2000s was a goal for this town.
Sure.
To make sure that we could operate as lean and mean as we could. So you're going to see a lot of that here. And maybe now's the time to strike that stuff out like you're suggesting. And that's
But that's
fine.
why this should be a living document.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think, it's been 6 years since we sat down with the group
Yeah.
and gone through this, so absolutely.
And then I thought that based on the calendar later in the document where we start with a budget message and directive, that sort of starts the whole process, and it seems to me that something about that should be mentioned in the goals. You know, if there's something that is kicking off the entire budget process, then I think that should hopefully, fulfilling whatever that is should be one of our goals. So
In a timely manner.
Same.
so-
fulfilling the lawfully established goals of the town meeting and the
Probably
select
the
board.
thing that I thought that we didn't do this past year that we probably should is get the finance team, before the budget message goes out, before we start collecting the budgets, to go through our forecast sheet and give us a lay of the land saying, this is what we're seeing over the next 3 to 5 years. We have the tool. Nobody knows that we have the tool, basically, except the people in the finance office. We need to show that when we put out a forecast, we know what we're really talking about, and what tweaks need to be made, as you get closer to the event, you can fine tune things a lot better. And that's what we need to make sure that we have a fine tuned forecast before we go into the budget session, so that you can put out the appropriate message and say, okay, town, this is gonna be another lean year, we need level funded budgets again, or we're gonna see a little extra in revenue stream, we can take a 1% increase, at the max, that type of thing. But
Yeah.
that's something that should be done well before that budget message goes out to the departments.
So is that, if we were looking at the calendar,
That should probably be the first thing that happens.
is that the same thing as, so the budget message directive is developed in September, and that directive is based on the Board of Selectmen's goals.
And probably should be based on the financial projections also. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, I think it's right now, so say one of the board goals was to, was to say find a new a home or do the redevelopment of 36 King Street or Nagog. So some of those things don't tie directly into the budget message. They aren't necessarily in conflict either, but they aren't necessarily relatable. But we also have like another one on where we talk about economic development and what and working with the Economic Development Committee to try to pursue opportunities there. So I think it may be, what I'd say to you too, Karen, you have a retreat coming up soon, so maybe to think about what those goals should be and how they evolve to tie into that message too. So there may be some things that do and other things that maybe don't. But that makes sense to have them tie together.
So, basically it's just some type of lay of the land. This is where we are financially. This is what we project for the next 2 to 5 years. And then incorporate the goals of the select board into that. There's your budget message for the year.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Which leads into number 9, building the forecast. Building a forecast that's sustainable. Right now, we don't have a sustainable budget.
Mm-hmm.
We have deficits projected for the next 3 to 5 years. Which leads us into the levy section and the split tax rate section, talking about those things. Guidelines, any suggestions on the financial guidelines?
Steve, I have a general, I think a glossary also might be helpful in here, so everyone knows what you're defining to be a structural deficit and excess levy capacity, and what these terms mean for this document, so everyone's in agreement.
Okay, we certainly add that in here. I mean, some things are, that's why I want a discussion of what these things are, because excess levy capacity is just a general term. It's not something special to us.
Right.
But everybody needs to understand that.
Right.
So one of the things that when the select board does the tax rate, for example, one of the things that they used to have to vote, I'm not certain if they have to vote it again, is the amount of excess levy capacity that's there. So boards would vote it every year and without an idea of what they were voting or why they were voting. Yes, we can certainly add that. Maintenance of the town's credit rating. And we feel that there's always been questions that I've received over the years how much does it cost us to maintain a AAA rating? And I would answer that question as, no, it doesn't cost us anything to maintain the AAA. It's the things we do financially in building a stable financial framework for the town that gets us that AAA bond rating. So it's what steps are we taking that we're doing to be financially stable, right? That you want to then eliminate to become less stable, which then would affect your AAA bond rating, which increase your cost because now your borrowing costs are higher. It's kind of like and we can talk about more of that when we get to the free cash and that whole discussion there. But it's not, I don't think the goal necessarily is to be a AAA community. The goal is to be financially stable, which then gets you that AAA bond rating. It's kind of a result of it. Would you kind of agree?
Yeah.
So the AAA is more the metric,
Yeah.
or is a metric.
Right.
And for the last 8 or 9 years, interest rates have been artificially low, basically managed by the federal government. And interest rates, people are panicking over 6% mortgages. I never had a 6% mortgage, and I paid off 2 in the town. So I think that there's a whole generation of people that are used to 2, 3, 4, maybe a 4% mortgage, but above that is panic. And our ability to borrow at, in some cases, sub 1%, versus in a more aggressive interest rate environment, you can borrow at 4 instead of 6 or 7 with the bond rate. So I think that as interest rates continue to stay strong, it'll become more and more obvious how valuable having that high bond rating is to the town. I mean, the treasurer and finance director ought to be able to actually demonstrate that, how many hundreds of thousands of dollars it'll save us on a project, where the difference between 1% and 1.2% just wasn't that much.
And then there's a lot of things that go into the rating, and it says over here that are beyond the town's control. I mean, economic factors, they're just out in general, and then specifically to the town. What are we seeing? All our businesses closing up, and that's goes into the whole determination of our bond rating, management structure. Our reserves are a huge part of it, but it's all different components that work together to get us to where we need to be. And from the ratings calls that you've been on so far, I mean,
On the offering statement, that you sent me.
yeah.
Steve, my thought on this was I was curious if this would potentially prevent, like, the select board or the finance committee from making a recommendation that would perhaps jeopardize that AAA bond rating if they felt that it was, perhaps in the best interest or a need for the citizens. But as I review the document, this policy just intends to provide best practices. So I think it's entirely appropriate that best practices is a AAA bond rating, and we don't really need to be worried about, no board is governed by this document. Is that correct? So this is just a guideline, guidance. Wouldn't prevent action from the select board if you wanted to do anything where that would potentially jeopardize that AAA.
That's true. And the select board has the authority to go outside of this policy when
Then
they
that's fine.
want.
Yeah.
It would probably be against the finance
Hairball
committee's
won't, yeah.
recommendation, but they certainly can
Sure.
in anything.
I have no question. I just. Is there an extra copy anywhere that I might be able to have? Sorry. Is it an RSVP? Thank you.
You're welcome.
In, Steve, in section 5, it talks about longer-term financial goals and short-term, but it never defines what longer-term means or short-term. The last 2 lines, the following section outlines the longer-term financial goals. That may not be, and then it says may not be attainable in the short term. I just don't know what's the scope of a longer term? Is that a 5-year goal or a 3-year goal or?
And that's probably one of the statements that were made when we were first putting this thing together, and it's never been updated and changed. Because we had things in the plan that we certainly couldn't do right away. You know, remember way back when, just handling our capital plan, which wasn't consistent for me to do. So we had certain things that we knew we wanted to get to. We knew it was going to take a few years to get there.
Yeah, I'm just.
I'd say it's safe to say that anything that's in this policy right now, we've kind of met. I can't think of anything that we haven't attained, and we're just moving forward, and this is the direction that we need to keep. So that could be one of the statements that is outdated now.
So it might just be, it outlines the financial goals and not the longer term.
Sure. And that second sentence, probably okay then, to leave that.
Yeah.
Okay. Tax levy, any comments on that section? You want to discuss it in case there's things in there that didn't make sense to people? Excess levy capacity is a big part of that, Mark. You want to go through it?
Sure.
Okay. So, excess levy capacity is a strategy that's used by a lot of towns in Massachusetts, where you don't raise the amount of levy capacity that you have. Okay. A lot of those towns that do that then rely on debt exclusion overrides or even operational overrides. Why they handle it that way is beyond me. There's a danger in leaving excess levy capacity. Not a danger to the, certainly, it's an okay practice to have, but you have to have limitations. And I think this policy addresses those limitations. And what I mean by that is one select board could come in and say, oh, we're not going to raise the full levy this year. We're going to leave $1 million on the table in excess levy capacity. So the citizens are happy because their tax rate goes down. A year later, the next board comes in because there's turnover on the board, and they say, what was that board thinking in leaving $1 million in excess levy capacity? They're going to raise the full levy. So that means that the taxpayer's tax rate went from here down to here because we had excess levy capacity. Now they're going to raise not only the $1 million that they left on the table, but the 2.5% that normally would go up. So now the spike in the tax rate goes back up to here, whereas if they left things alone, the tax rate would probably be here, more like this, instead of like that. So it certainly is a danger. There's things in here that talk about that we can't do that until, and that's the first 3 bullet points there, our reserve levels are met. So why would you leave excess levy capacity if you're not fulfilling the reserve levels that you want? If your projections show a structural deficit, how can you justify leaving excess levy capacity if you can't fund your projected expenses for the next 3 years? And the third thing is, when we have to be essentially fully funded in our OPEB and pension, so those liabilities are gone. So we haven't met those things. There was a short period of time where we did meet 1 and 2, and we were just waiting for 3, but now we don't even meet 2 anymore. So those are the things that would say, we need to satisfy those things before we can even consider having excess levy capacity. And then to talk about how you handle that excess levy capacity, I believe, is on the next page. Top of the page. So it talks about how it, yes, reduces the tax rate and things like that. But to guard against one board doing one thing and the next board coming in to do another, it says you can only use it for unforeseen emergencies. So basically, if you leave $1 million on the table, this is saying that you always should leave $1 million on the table. That's the goal. And if you're going to switch that to leave $200,000 on the table, you can use 8, then it should be for an emergency, something that we can't really fund. You know, something happened to one of the town buildings and things like that. Or to pay down an exclusion item. So to pay the debt service, we have the debt exclusion stabilization account. But this was written before we had that. So you could pay part of your excluded debt, which reduces the tax rate and offsets the increase in the tax rate that you're going to have by lowering the excess levy capacity.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep. So why isn't one of the policies on the tax levy before you do the excess to fund the fully fund the stabilization funds? It's not a reserve fund.
It is. But they're all considered reserve funds.
Even
Stabilization, free cash, it's all reserve funds.
debt exclusion is
It's all-
still,
yeah.
okay, well, still considered
It's all
reserve.
reserves.
Okay.
I was gonna say it might be helpful to drill down on number 1 a little more, instead of saying outlined in this policy, if we could list them even. You know, trying to comb through the document to figure out what the reserve levels outlined in the policy are.
Okay.
It's a little opaque.
So it's either list them or refer to the section where it says.
Yeah.
Yep.
Shoot, I had another question and I lost it.
You can also put them in the glossary too, you know,
Sure.
supplemented, but, you know, almost 2 places. maybe.
Yep. Do you have something else, Karen?
Yeah, I just had a question. So when we're paying down debt ahead of anything else, almost ahead of anything else, but we're also working really hard to maintain a AAA bond rating so that we have very low rates of borrowing. At some point, aren't we making decisions that cost us money in the sense that we are deciding to pay down debt that we've received at a lower rate than what we would be spending it on if we were to just make the investment now?
We pay down the debt according to the schedule that we have to follow.
Mhm.
It's not that we're paying extra on our debt service to pay down.
So
anything.
when do we not pay down our debt according to the schedule?
You always do.
So then why is that a condition precedent here?
You don't pay down your debt, you don't have a rating, you lose your bond rating.
Where are you
Or
looking
maybe
at?
I'm,
which
maybe
end are
I'm
you
missing,
looking at?
maybe I'm not using the right terminology.
What section, Karen?
But you're saying, I thought you were saying, it was there for a minute and then I lost it. I
The
thought
debt exclusion piece
Yeah.
on page 3?
cover existing debt exclusion payments.
Right. So it's not that, all we're doing is shifting the payment from outside the levy to inside the levy.
Mm-hmm.
We're still making the same payment that we have to make.
Okay,
It's just the impact
not
to the
paying ahead.
taxpayer. Yeah.
Got it,
It's like
okay,
the debt exclusion stabilization account.
got it.
We're funding that we're paying outside the levy money from inside the levy money,
Mm-hmm. Got
which
it.
reduces the tax rate. So that's a strategy that we have. So instead of doing the excess levy capacity piece, if the town has voted a project to be an excluded debt, then any excess money that we have can go to reducing that, which reduces the tax rate.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay.
We've had projects that we've gone to the town for, asked for an exclusion, and stood up and said, we fully intend to pay this off inside 2.5. But if we get in trouble, they at least have the vote to allow us to 1 year or 2 years pay it outside. So we have that practice and historical practice in place that we've used a number of
I know
times.
the last time we did it with the track. We had an exclusion vote on the track, and we were able to pay that 100% within the levy.
Inside the limit, right?
There was a couple of projects right around that time also that we did. I think when we hooked up the SOAR for the
Right,
old police
old
station and the
yeah.
fire station,
yep.
we did the same thing.
Steve.
So it's not something that we can do all the time. Yes.
I apologize, I'm new to this whole process, et cetera. Is there?
Sorry, can you say your name?
Yes, Robert Brown's 25 Juniper Road.
Thank you.
Is there a public, what is the process from this discussion with respect to public feedback? Or is there only, does it surface in a agenda with a vote to be taken, which public comment, I'm not familiar enough with the process, and I find myself, in light of the town vote, with the, kind of like a series of questions. For example, MBTA, if that had failed.
So Rob, I don't know if I understand the question. So how do you get involved with the budget process, or is that the question?
Well,
Or-
these policies appear to shape actions that should be followed
Right.
in the event of circumstances as they
Yeah.
come before us, before you, residents. I find myself questioning because of the sequence that I'm reading, and I might be reading them incorrectly,
Mhm.
hence the question of how does the public ask questions, because we've had a series of town votes that some have gone in surprising ways to be reversed, and yet if they hadn't been reversed, MBTA, for example, I just find myself wondering how these policies would be administered.
Right.
I
So-
could go on with other examples, I don't want to.
Yeah, so I think, Rob, you got to think of the financial policies as the foundational elements of how we establish our annual operating budget, our annual and capital budget. So these are the, sort of, again, foundational elements of how we think of that, how we contribute to reserves, things of that nature. So as it relates to other questions that, the town meeting was voting on MBTA zoning, what the impacts of that would be, it's almost, it's related, but it's not fully related to anything here, because these are the policies that the select board and the finance committee have in presenting that budget to town meeting. Now, if town meeting takes other actions outside of that, then, this is just the policy of the working group, the finance committee, and the select board have toward, developing the capital and operating budgets. So this is where it starts.
So, add a little bit to that. The FinCom once this is finalized, the FinCom will hold a meeting or two, and they will vote to accept this. And once that happens, it will come to the select board, and there'll be a meeting or two where the select board votes to accept this document. Is the policy.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Any questions on the split tax rate section? So this is just basically saying, just summing up, the big piece of this would be on page 4. Number 4, be mindful of the 150% CIP factor. And even if there's a formula that's used when we're going through the classification hearing materials. The 150% limits, if you remember the pie that we always show, 50% of the residential can go to the commercial, so you can make that shift. In some years, when you do run through the numbers and the equation that the state has, sometimes that 150 could turn into 175%. And what this policy is saying is, don't fall for that. Don't go to the 175, even though you're allowed to, because in the next year, it could fall back to 150, which was the case a couple of years ago. It was 175, then it fell back to 150. So if you make the mistake to go to 175, the impact of the residential taxpayer will be huge in that second
The
year.
following pendulum's really
Right.
swings.
Can you explain the 150 CIP factor?
In a town that just has a single tax rate,
Yep.
which is most towns in the state, you just take the amount that you're gonna collect and levy by the total value, and that's your tax rate. That's the end of it. In a split tax rate, you divvy up basically a pie. Think of a pie. This much is the residential piece, this much is the commercial piece. You're able to take part of the residential piece that the residents owe for taxes and shift that over to the commercial tax base. So they're picking up that, so the residential tax rate goes down, the commercial tax rate goes up, because they're responsible for a bigger piece of the levy that they normally would have been.
Mm-hmm.
So with the select board, in November of each year, makes that determination and says, how much are we gonna shift from the residential piece to the commercial piece? And it's always a tough decision that they have to make.
Sure.
Because they're thinking not only the short-term things that are happening, but long-term, what do we see happening with commercial growth in the town? Are we gonna make a decision now that again, helps the residential taxpayer this year, but kills them in future years if there's more commercial base that comes in?
Mm-hmm.
Because then we can't shift as much over there. So it's
So how's the 150 work? What's the 150? How does the 150%?
you're able to shift 50% of the
Residential, right?
of the residential piece of the pie
Mm-hmm.
over to the commercial bucket. So the select board has that ability to go to 150. They usually keep it at around 130 or so, because once you get to that 150 and you reach that limit, then anything you do is going to affect the residents in the next year. So there was one board, probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, that hit that 150.
Okay.
And it took a good 3 to 4 years before we could wean it off without killing the residents.
So the commercial tax rate can only be 150% of the residential tax rate. That's what that means. Okay.
Yes.
It's not necessarily the rate, it's the levy piece of it. That's-
The dollars. Okay.
And remember, when the board votes on it, they're also voting on what that shift could look like. So Steve mentioned we've been kind of hovering around 130, and so I think you like 10 different scenarios of what this would look like. I mean, I think typically we show what 150 would look like, but isn't typically something we'd recommend because it's kind of hard to pull back from that, as well as the fact that I think the Economic Development Committee and the board is trying to kind of find that balance and trying to be also a little more business friendly and not, while still having the tax split, but not doing too much on that front.
And there could be times when you want to do that,
Mm-hmm.
like in times when the commercial base just fell apart. Most of the buildings on Foster Street empty and commercial buildings everywhere, values go down. So their piece of the pie went down. So you're able to shift more and maybe take a little bit more than the 150 and going up to 140, closer to 150 on that case, until the commercial base recovers. It's just, enough that you can shift that back. But, we're not in that scenario just yet, but a few years back, we kind of saw that. But then the point happened, and a commercial base went way back up. Unfortunately, it was right around the time when the select board pushed it to 150, and we kind of hit the taxpayer for the next couple of years, the residential taxpayer. So it's a balancing act that they need to play.
Okay.
That's where they earn their money. Is everybody good with that section? That's basically what it's talking about. Just above section 9 talks about the working session that's done before the classification hearing. So that's when you get all the materials, you hear the presentation, things like that. In past years, it was always the select board meeting before the classification hearing. This year, we did it at the same meeting, I believe.
Yes.
So a lot of it depends on the schedule that we're faced again, when
Yeah, and we're trying.
when town meeting's scheduled and when Kathy.
We're doing it that way again this year, right?
You're right,
Yeah.
that's right, yeah. It helps us because if you get too close to, push it out too far, then it becomes an issue for us to set the tax rate
Yeah.
in a timely way. Year before, when we did it, what did we, just by mere hours, I think we.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Yeah,
I
it
wasn't
was,
there.
It was,
it was a
really
couple of
touch and
hours
go.
we had.
Yeah, very, very close.
Touch and
Made a
go.
lot of people very uncomfortable.
There's a lot of things that would probably never realized, is that whole period, between the budgets and the classification hearing and town meeting and getting the tax bills out. The timing of that is really crucial. You have to start with when our deadline to get the tax bills in the mail is and work backwards. Set town meeting there, set the classification hearing, to give everybody enough time to get, especially with Kathy, to get all the stuff from DOR set. But that's that process. So, abatements. This is something that is in this policy that I don't think has ever really been done. This is talking about the Select Board and the Board of Assessors meeting to discuss an overall strategy for abatements. It's not trying to take power away from the Board of Assessors, because that's their purview, but things really, personally, I don't think things need to happen in a vacuum like that. And I'm not certain that the Select Board gets the information that they should about the level of abatements that happen each year. How much do we have at the Appellate Tax Board right now? How much do we have an overlay? I mean, those are all things that the Select Board should probably be very aware of. And I'm not certain that happens or has ever happened. But it's in this policy, and it's always been in this policy. So that's something that probably the Select Board and Jim and Ryan need to talk about with Fred of the Board of Assessors and see what you can do. Even if it's just an information session, not even a strategy session, just an information session. This is the level of abatements that we had, and abatement applications that were due in February. This is how many we approved. This is the effect on overlay. This is the amount we have at the Appellate Tax Board. This is the amount that could be in jeopardy out of our overlay. And we saw how close we cut the overlay a couple of years ago. Right? So that's what that section is, and
I think that's probably a good policy. My only question is, should FinCom be there too? Do you have
Certainly can be.
I'm asking what the role is for FinCom in that discussion more.
To hear the same message, because it is probably important for the FinCom to hear. also.
Basically, in my opinion, it would be risk assessment. If they have a lot hanging out there, that, if they could put a sort of a 1 to 10 on the risk factor, and how we treat reserves against that might be worthwhile. But I would think that would sort of be the finance committee role in that threesome.
The other thing I would suggest is the policy suggests a time, I mean, when best would be to hold that meeting? Is it something you do in September or February?
Well, it depends
or-
what you want to get. If it's a strategy session where you're saying, let's be aggressive and start denying a lot of stuff, that needs to happen probably before February,
Early on.
because that's when the abatement applications are due February 1st. If it's more of an informational session after the fact, probably now is a good time to have it, because they've probably made 90% of the determinations. They know what's at the appellate tax board already. And there are some big cases already pending.
And I think you got to be a little careful too, because the Board of Assessors has their own level of autonomy. So in terms of what we're hearing, it's going to be more, it would be good in terms of thinking in terms of the strategy maybe in the beginning, but we do have to be careful about that. So even when you say like, oh, let's bring the FinCom in too, that sometimes can create its own set of problems, because you have an independent board that's elected that's going to say, well, this is our purview. So it's something that it just has to be delicately.
Absolutely. They're the experts on it.
Was that?
We
Yeah,
called
yeah.
it a briefing? Was
Yeah,
that
and I think the idea of a strategy session to know too what's coming in is important, and what to push back on. So I think briefing / update. So the meeting has value. It's just in terms of we probably want to do it in the beginning side of things before they start getting too heavy into.
If we're considering sort of either the strategy session or the review session later in the process, maybe the way to start it is have it a meeting relatively soon, because this past cycle is basically done. So let's have a briefing, let's have an update of where we are, and see if it feels like we should then take the next step.
The big piece of that, getting back to where the budget impact would be is if we determine that overlay is going to be short.
Right.
So if overlay is going to be short, that's an expense line item. We take that right off the top. We fund that right away. So if that's taken away from the operating budget, we should be aware of that before we get into the budget sessions.
Right.
And a lot of the abatements too, it's kind of hard to predict what's going to happen. You don't know, it's a risk assessment at that point, like how much could we lose at this point? What does that look like vis-a-vis the overlay?
If
And
they,
that's information that Kathy should.
if they could give us sort of a sensitivity analysis on portfolio, if you want to call it that, and then we all could
And
make our
sometimes.
own assessment.
Sometimes the cases that we get, the abatement applications we get, and the things that proceed to the ATB are because we became more aggressive. We changed strategy. This year Kathy was more aggressive on warehouses. She got an appraisal done on OP, which applies to every other warehouse wrapped. So those values all went up, and a lot of them balked at the value increase. And those are the cases that are in front of us. So there's an exposure to the overlay, but it's also an increase in the tax base and taxing these companies and entities fairly.
Thinking about that, I wonder if it would make sense to use Homestead as sort of a pilot assessment for all the apartments that are going to be coming down the road in 3 to 5 years. And sort of go in and cut your teeth on that apartment building, see how it feels, and then, basically, if it worked well, okay. If it didn't, then what do you tweak before you get the behemoth coming online?
Yeah, it's not so much those, it's probably the ones more at the town line, the Acton line, those two apartment buildings there.
Okay.
Those are more like
More
what's going
akin to that, okay. But
So you get an appraisal done on that, you see if you're taxing them properly there, and then you apply that same logic to those buildings as they get built.
Or even back here. You could apply that logic back here.
Sure.
So I
Any
forgot about
multi-unit,
those up
yeah.
on the line, but the same argument, because, you know, we really should try to have our ducks in a row before that thing shows up, or, you know, up on Foster Street shows up. So,
I know Kathy and the assessors look for that every year as to
what's the next?
what's the next thing that they could look at.
Right.
So if they need warehouses, and what are they gonna do? Because we do fund that in the budget.
Yeah. Well, maybe in that meeting, we could even suggest that they look at the apartment as the next one.
Exactly,
Because-
that's something else that can be
Yes.
discussed
Yeah.
with the board.
Okay.
Tax relief programs. This is basically saying that there's two kinds of tax relief programs. There's some that get paid out of the overlay. There's some that get shifted. I know Chuck and Gary are looking at something like this with the senior thing, with the seniors would get a tax break, but it's picked up by the other residents, and the rest of the residential tax base picks up that thing. Whereas the senior workout program, it comes out of the overlay. So as these programs get suggested, it's two pieces of information to figure out is it coming out of the overlay, which then affects your potential that you need to fund it, or is it something that's going to affect the rest of the tax base? And you need to weigh those decisions against the benefit of. So that's all that is saying. TIFs and pilots. This has always been a contentious section. There's a lot of people in past boards who say no TIFs at all. There's some that say TIFs are useful. What this section is saying before we do something on a case-by-case basis for a TIF, there should be an internal committee set up that investigates why we're doing it and whether it's worth doing, and the impacts of doing such a thing. Then it's up to the select board and town meeting to approve that as we move forward.
Have we done that in the past?
Yes, we've had TIFs and we've
Oh, I know we've had
this
TIFs, but
committee-
have we established those committees?
Yes, the
Okay.
committee is generally made up of the treasurer, the finance director, a select board member, the chief assessor, and probably the chair of the board of assessors.
Do we want to document that? What that committee should look like?
Sure. Can certainly do that. We'll establish tax increment financing pilot committee that will negotiate any agreements based on goals, objectives, and priorities established by the board, by the select board. The board is comprised of committee.
Sitting member of the select board.
SB, finance director, we'll get Jim involved too, the town administrator.
No. No, I'm not kidding.
No?
When I say that, in all likelihood, I'll be presenting it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Or the position would be.
Treasurer, chief assessor, member of the board of assessors. I don't think FinCom.
Yeah, no.
That's a good group.
Yeah.
How many you got? How many are there?
1, 2, 3, 5. Did I go over everyone?
So priorities established by the select board, are you envisioning that each TIF has its own set of priorities established, or there's general priorities we're trying to establish?
Case by case, it's individual.
It's,
I'm
I know
sorry.
the TIF agreement is
Yeah, I'm sorry,
individual.
could you repeat that?
It says, there were, on the second to last line says, objectives and that will negotiate any agreements based on goals, objectives, and priorities established by the select board. So those goals, priorities are per TIF or general goals and priorities?
so let me give you the background on this one. So when, there was a time period where we were doing,
TIFs like candy.
you got it. And before, I think it may have been as a result of potpourri, because it was so generous with potpourri, that there was a thought process, and I may have even come from Keith, to set up like a rating grid. You know, it's gonna get so many jobs in town, it's gonna provide this much in tax increase. And each thing had its own little rating bucket. And you add up the scores, and the final score of that tally said whether you would allow a TIF or not. So there was priorities that the town would have as an overall thing. There, we did find a town, I forget what town it was, that had that model, and they were using it. It was okay, in my opinion, because things just differ so much. Because Sal is gonna be promising things, and Sal's gonna want a TIF. And can you fit all that into one basket, and is there any wiggle room in what you're gonna do? That's why it probably should be case by case, and what the select board thinks is worthwhile or not. And then it's up to the finance team internally to come up with, here's the cost of what you're thinking of doing. Is it worthwhile doing it? In the case of potpourri, I don't think it was, but in the
As it
case.
turns out.
As it turns out. And, you know, in reading this also, that last sentence there, remember, but 2 years ago, select board met to take the TIF away from potpourri? It's automatic in this policy. So the vote really should have been to not take the TIF away. Because this says basically, once the state says it's no good, we rely on the state. And we should have just voided it right then and there.
Good thing we voted to get rid of it.
Exactly.
No, the reason I'm asking about that is because I think for, when Sal comes up and asks for a TIF, we could just come up with whatever policies we want at the time for him to justify giving him one. And if, they want to do more work at the point, we could come up with policies for that, right? So we can, if you're taking the policies on an individual case-by-case basis, we can make the case for all of them depending on the mood of the board, right? It's not a general policy statement that, we can justify any TIF we
But
want.
it's also the level of the TIF that you're going to agree to. I mean, some could be very short in time that only gives a limited tax break.
Right,
Some, like potpourri, was extended with a huge tax break.
right. So I'm wondering if the two should be separated more, right? That the select board have the policy on, we think what Sal is doing merits a TIF, and then the committee determines the level of the TIF. Somehow we separate the two, like, we think this project qualifies for a look, right? For a TIF, and to separate the two, right? You can tell me
So I
Crazy,
think
but-
it has to start with the select board, number one. And the select board needs to give the finance team internally the go-ahead to start investigating, coming with some terms, and maybe getting that group together.
Yeah, but I don't know what goals, objectives, and priorities we're trying to establish on individual projects.
It depends on the project too, Mark, the idea of the policy is trying to, provide some broad parameters, not necessarily, you know, it doesn't have to be so prescriptive, because the circumstances for which you'd look at one project is a TIF, and why you'd look favorably on it versus another. I mean,
Yeah, but our goals, objectives, and priorities shouldn't matter based on the project.
Would you be more comfortable with direction?
I'm just trying to figure out, like, you know,
Because it's not, you're right, it's not really goals, objectives, and priorities that we're likely to establish on a case-by-case basis. And if we are, then it's not really worth putting in the policies.
right.
Well, on the flip side.
Because we
of
won't
that
ratify
is a goal, objective, and priority for that particular project that you're going to give marching orders to a group.
Right.
I mean, you're looking for, I mean, if
So
you're trying,
either way.
it's also what you're trying to incentivize too, so it isn't as vanilla as you'd think, in terms of if you're trying to incentivize housing,
Right.
and that's one thing versus if you're trying to
Incentivize
incentivize retail or
employment.
something,
Or
employment, right?
employment, like-
So,
like
yeah, so
agree.
that's why the, you know, some flexibility here probably makes sense, because even whatever board might be looking at that time is going to be fluid, because housing may be more important at one time, or
Yep.
retail, or employment, you know, it all depends, so.
I agree that it's fluid, but it's not fluid on a per-project basis. It's fluid over.
Depends on the project, though, that's what we're trying to say.
I don't think so, though.
Like, if you're gonna look at what's being built at 550, and you say, we're looking for employment, well, you're not gonna get it there.
Right,
Mhm.
Whereas potpourri, you could say, you were supposed to hire X number of
right, but if we're
people.
looking for housing, then we should be saying housing, and the MBTA 1 versus 550 shouldn't matter for a TIF, right? It should just be housing. We determined that, you know, things that are built, you know, these apartments, or whatever we're calling it, should be eligible for a TIF, and that's the general policy, and it's not because we have 550 we're looking at it, it's because this is what we want to encourage.
Would you like to see the scoring thing that we may have come up with?
I'm not really sure.
Because
Yeah, maybe.
it does exactly, it lists different categories and things that were priorities for the town back then,
Yeah,
and it assigns a point value to it.
yes.
This much for whatever, it's in an economic development zone, you got so many points. That type of thing.
I'm just worried that if you do these on a case-by-case basis, you can make a case for any of them.
But isn't that
That's the select
internal to
board.
the Board of Selectmen and not, I mean,
It's one of
that's
those
an us
things,
thing.
Yeah.
that
it's
grid.
one of those things that I don't think you want to tie your hands to say, this policy, we come out and we say, we're gonna give you a tip because our policy says you're gonna give you a tip. I think you need to have some fluidity, so when you wanna say no, you just say no.
Discretion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, Rob?
Rob Houston, 55 Jennifer Street. These policies are supposed to be reviewed once a year, once every 2 years. To add on to Mark's point, I guess what I would say is I think it's incumbent on the select board every year or every 2 years to identify that board's goals, policies, objectives for the town. And if that year it's housing, or that year it's employment, or that year it's retail activity, whatever it is, because that's how you signal to Jim and Ryan and the economic development people what it is the town is looking for. So then you're attracting those types of businesses. They fit in that overarching policy. I'm kind of adding a framework, I guess, that says, I agree that you don't want it coming before the select board, because he's right. You can justify anything, either yes or no, on a case-by-case basis. I do think the select board should be doing this regularly. What is it we want to incentivize to such an extent that we're willing to give free tax money to these people who come into our town? Which should be few and far between, in my humble opinion.
Right, so then
So-
we're spinning our wheels, trying to figure out some granular formula for situations that might never arise, and we're doing
But I don't
it
think it's
annually.
granular, that was my point. Housing, or employment, or, it really isn't granular, is all I'm trying to say.
It's not, but what's the value? When is housing not going to be a priority for us, and when is it going to be more of a priority than bringing in, commercial businesses?
Well, right now.
I mean, yeah, no, I mean, right now, I don't know.
Anyway, I didn't mean to digress, I'm sorry, I took everybody along.
Good input. No,
Well, what this, I mean, I think this reads, what this is saying is there should be a committee established, we identify the members that we'd like the committee to represent, and they should take direction from the select board.
Right,
Basically, that's all.
and how
And
we
you're a select
arrive
member.
at that, how we arrive at that direction.
So if you want, once you establish this committee, if the select board then wants to inform this committee, Bob, to your point, what we're looking for, let's get the feelers out, this is what the town needs, that's great, but I don't necessarily think those details need to be in here.
Because they're gonna change.
Because they're gonna change, exactly. Agree.
And then you can say, let the school committee handle it.
Yep. Did you adjust to that list?
I did not hear the school committee. As a member of that board,
So we go to leaving that?
I'm good with it as is.
Yeah, good.
With that.
Free cash. I did add a couple of things to this free cash section, based on, again, what we went through this budget. One of the things, if you're not familiar with the free cash calculation, so what this is basically saying is that we have a level of 5% of the operating budget that we maintain as a free cash balance. And then we start spending, and you start spending A, B, C, and D, and E now, to the levels that are there. So capital projects, 2.5% of the operating budget you can spend on capital, first thing. Then you say, in order to spend any more, you have to reach this benchmark, which is 7.5%. So it's basically adding an extra 2.5% to the reserve level. And then after that, you can spend up to 20% on OPEB and pension. You replenish your reserves using 50% max on those things. And what I just added was 10% on blended CPC funds. Then, if anything is left over and above that 7.5% threshold, then you can spend extra on extraordinary deficits or additional capital. So in years past, before we were able to generate the level of free cash that we do, we were running into a cycle where we would generate free cash, we'd spend it all the way through that second capital bucket, and then the second year, we weren't able to regenerate free cash, so we could only spend up to that first 5% limit. And we were going through a cycle like that, so every other year, we were able to build up capital. Then it got to the point where we were actually able to generate enough free cash to sustain the capital budget year in, year out, all the way out to that second capital project, which is now H. I don't see that changing that much moving forward unless we run into the situation where we did this year, where we had to start taking, increasing our level of revenues in the budget. So we increased our local receipts. Local receipts is the biggest generator of free cash that we have. By increasing that, we're decreasing the amount that goes into this calculation. We still have the capital needs. Get to the point where you can't replenish your free cash, you start borrowing for projects, which then leads to extra borrowing costs, which increases your operating budget, which has less for your day-to-day operations because you're spending everything in debt service. So if we're not able, so this is the key thing, if we're not able to replenish free cash, the whole capital plan and those forecasts that we have for the operations right now go to crap because our debt service costs go through the roof. The reason we put this in here to begin with was, I'll give you some history, because Fred and I go back to the Stone Age here. We were borrowing for every single thing. And it got to the point where our borrowing costs were 10 to 15% of the budget. So we had nothing for extra money, no salaries. Town hall went without raises for 2 or 3 years at one point. We were spending everything in debt service. We said, enough's enough, we need to get off of this, basically. We went through 3 or 4 years of capital exclusions. So we didn't spend anything, we didn't borrow for anything, we didn't hit free cash for anything. We did capital exclusions. So 1 year, you raise the tax rate, you buy your fire truck, you buy your dump truck, whatever you're buying,
You pay for
and
it
you
1 year.
pay for it
which
1
is
year.
Basically an
and it's gone.
override for each capital
So we
item.
did that for 3-4 years in a row. Meanwhile, we built up our free cash reserves. We weaned off of those capital exclusions, and we've been doing this funding through free cash ever since. And that was, I just said it at a town meeting too, the last time we borrowed for capital. It was a while ago,
Yeah.
15 years or something. So we've been
2008.
operating this way, and it's had its ebbs and flows in the early stages, but we're at a pretty consistent level right now because of the ability to regenerate free cash. To the point where we have to start using local receipts and eating away from this, we start to shove it back into where we were, and we don't want that to happen. So free cash is very important. Getting to the point in the next few years, and I can see this happening in, I don't know, maybe the next 3 to 5 years, we'll be there sooner with OPEB than we will with pension, but we should be fully funded in those things within, I'd say, the next 3 to 5 years, which is going to free up some money, which then can be put to additional capital, because if you remember the capital plan that was developed this year by the department heads, it's huge. And over the next,
Yeah.
10 years, it
Mhm.
was $20 million or
I
something
can't
like that.
remember what it was, but yeah, that's a lot.
In the short term, it was even,
Yeah.
$9, $10 million because school roofs were there. And that's not even,
And then the
including
HVAC
Shaker Lane,
systems
yeah.
too. for that.
it's got nothing to do with Shaker Lane either. I mean, that's.
Correct.
Yeah. So this whole calculation that's done with now Ryan and Robin to go through this is probably one of the big keys that we have, our ability to regenerate free cash and use it appropriately. I'm added the CPC because we had that discussion back at last September or so before the budget cycle started, where the select board wanted to increase the surcharge to 2 or 3%. We said, we'll try what we can to get as much over there as we can within the budget. We did that this year to the tune of $260,000. Now, this is saying, up to 10% of whatever that free cash number is, we can shove that in there of that excess, so it probably should get, 10%. Last year, the 20% was $970, so we're looking at $400-something thousand if we apply this formula to what it was last year, which isn't too shabby. So it gets money in there.
So, can I just say that this section is outrageously confusing to read?
It is.
Because you're.
In a lot of cases, it's probably intentional.
Talk about a benchmark balance in section, in item 2 there, being 7.5% as noted in the definite, and when you go to the benchmark balance, it refers back to basically as it was defined earlier. So it's very circular and it's almost impossible to follow this section. So,
And when Bonnie wrote it, that was her intention.
so can we simplify it so that it's actually, I'm pretty good at math and I can't follow what this is actually saying. I can't tell if we can spend when it's above 5% or 7.5%, and then what that means we can spend when
It's
it's
generally
above 7.5%.
7.5%.
But even when it's above 7.5, I can't tell what it means. We can, yeah. I'm not disagreeing with the policy, I'm just disagreeing with the wording.
I totally get
of
it. It's always,
It's so obtuse, you can make it, convince me that it says pretty much whatever you want it to say, I think. Or I can sit here and argue that it doesn't say that.
again, this is another one that has always been contentious with certain select board members of the past who wanted to forget about funding reserves and forget about funding extra to OPEB and pension and put everything to capital. And this was a way that was come up with to ensure that we pay for those things that are important for the town, but still pay for a sufficient amount of capital that's needed. And I don't think there's anything that major that we haven't been able to fund through the capital plan. Now, whether it's saving up through capital stabilization to pay for something, or paying outright in the year for something like that, so. But I totally agree that this is a confusing piece, and unless you have your head on straight and you know what you're supposed to be doing, it can be very, as you said, obtuse.
Well, does that make it easy for people to take advantage of those, Steve? I mean, who's checking who's checking the obtuseness, for lack of a better word? Somebody's
That would be
preparing the numbers.
Finance team internally, the finance director and treasurer would know how much has been approved in free cash and come up through the calculation. There's a spreadsheet up in the treasurer's office that runs through exactly, so just fill in some of the numbers.
So presumably you'd be able to take that spreadsheet and run it through the words and say, and it would work?
Right, right.
Okay,
It's
that's all I care about.
I mean, I'm going to give you a little bit of leeway in the sense that, it's really, when you work with it on a regular basis, it really isn't that obtuse. It's formulaic based on, depending on what, what your operating budget is. So as the operation, budget goes down, the percentages change. It's a little bit challenging in terms of the explanation, but, in terms of how we're set up for it. And what we also do is we sit down with the chair of the finance committee as well, going through those numbers, making sure everything's right. So there's multiple eyes looking at it, so it's not, what we end up then presenting to town meeting reflects what's in here and keeping consistent with that. So.
Trust, Mark, trust.
Now, I'm just going through, so we're gonna maintain 7.5%, then anything above that is excess, right? And we're gonna fund the stabilization first, to whatever their minimum balance is. And then we're taking up to 2.5% of the operating budget for capital items, which I didn't even know there was.
So
line item.
A and B are done right off the top.
Right.
So out of whatever is available in free cash.
What does 2.5% of the operation budget for capital items mean? I don't know there's an operation
This
budget specifically
operating
for capital
budget-
items.
It should be a comma it's not operating budget for capital items, it's operating budget, comma,
For capital
for
items.
capital items.
2.5% of the operating budget.
So you
It's
know what
set
the
aside
operating
for
budget is,
capital
2.5%.
Each
Okay.
shoots leaves.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. So earlier when it's talking about the total operating budget, it still means total operating budget here when it's talking operating budget.
Yes.
Okay, so that would help to use the same terms throughout, right? So we're taking up to 2.5, okay. And then after that, we're taking at least 10% into OPEB of whatever's left of this 7.5% minus what we just put in the rest.
That,
And then up to 50% of whatever's left into other reserves.
see, I think as a minimum, that benchmark balance one, E, or is it F now? One of the two. Benchmark balance should probably be moved up
Well, I thought that
between
was
B and C.
effectively A, right? Because you said we
Between
can't
B
go
and
below.
C, because you can spend A and B, then you hit your benchmark, then you spend everything else.
Right.
So C, D, and E refer to the benchmark in H.
I thought two said basically, two defined the benchmark to be 7.5%.
Mhm.
So the new F doesn't really matter, or does it? Because you can't go below the 7.5% anyway. You're saying you need at least 5, but if it's not above 7.5, we're not gonna spend it anyway.
Correct.
For those extra items, yes. Anything other than A and B. A and B always happen.
Okay, so that's not the way it's worded though, earlier. So it doesn't say A and B always happen, it says, you know,
Those are the only two that don't refer to the benchmark.
And it has to refer to the benchmark to otherwise establish a limit, right? Yeah.
So to make that clear, we could, instead of not including keywords that are included later and hoping people understand that, couldn't we just say A, B, and then if, A and, like, and then if, and then set the condition, and then C, D, E, and
everything
F?
else flows from that.
And then move the benchmark
Right,
up.
I would,
Yeah.
I would move benchmark from the next page, which is
Put it to
F,
slot 3.
and move it in between A and
After
C.
Yeah.
C, E, F, P.
and then it's.
You got
two
A,
story
B, then you
required.
got benchmark, then you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, I'd actually change the numbering pattern probably too.
And then is 2 still required? Because basically, once you hit 7.5% at the new benchmark, you're not gonna, what does 2 really matter?
2 matters because you may not have enough
To get there.
to get there. So if you spend, if you don't have the free cash, and you spend A and B, if you're not at that 7.5, you don't spend another dime out of it.
Right.
Right.
But if you moved benchmark up to C, then you stop there anyway.
Right.
If you're saying if we're above 5, we fund stabilization and capital at whatever those levels are. And then if we're still above 7.5, we can spend
We can
below.
spend below.
You spend
right.
So
below,
you don't
in that
need
order.
number 2, because it's adding, it just, 2 is already covered by,
You're either at the benchmark or you're not.
right? So the first rule is you have to have 5%, and if you're at 5%, we'll do A and B, you know, the stabilization and capital. And then we have to be at 7.5, and then if we're at
To fall
7.5,
below it, yeah.
we'll take the excess above 7.5 and do below,
In that order.
in that
In
order.
that order.
And then you simplify this whole thing, and you probably don't need 1 through 4 quite the same way, right? You can just outline the steps. It becomes much more of a simple flow chart.
And what is can someone educate me on the dollars and cents argument for why we're prioritizing OPEB additional contributions over other reserve additional contributions, for example?
Again, at the time this was originally written, there were select board members who did not want to fund either of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And finance director and town administrator and myself at that time thought they were very important to fund.
Mm-hmm.
So we got,
Which I'm not questioning, but why C ahead of D?
So,
OPEB,
Is
the
my
liability
question.
is not.
yeah, right. So there's schedules on OPEB and there's schedules for retirement in terms of where we're sort of behind at this point. So part of what this is on both OPEB and pension is trying to play catch up. So to Steve's point, when we weren't funding those things at an adequate level, we were taking a hole and digging deeper. And this was a way to begin to address that so that we could be back on schedule. And at some point, this will, as to Steve's point, we stated earlier, like in 2 or 3 years, the hope is we'll be at that point and not have to be able to fund them. But that only has happened because we've been so aggressive in trying to pay, to get that back on schedule.
that not doing C would have a bigger impact than not funding your reserves
Okay.
in the long run.
So do we, because I get this question, you know, a lot would be an exaggeration. I've had the question posed. Why are we pouring all this extra money into OPEB? But it's not extra. It's not trying to get us ahead of where we should be. It's trying to get us up to where we should be. I think it might be helpful to say that, you know, somewhere. You know, if we're ever in the fortunate situation where we can get ahead, then maybe we want to reprioritize the
We're
the
required
list.
to be funded, correct, by a certain date.
Pension will be required by 2030
38, I think.
something, yes. There's no requirement right now on OPEB.
Okay,
There
it's just
probably will
pension.
be, yeah, at some point.
I wouldn't be surprised to be seeing that as part, yeah, right,
Okay.
as a requirement, looked at as part of the.
But as we said before, we're closer on OPEB than we are in pension right now. And we're well ahead of the county retirement board for pension. We're
Positive outlier.
yeah, they may be down like 40% fully funded, we're maybe 60% fully funded. So we're doing a lot better than the other communities are.
Why D in front of E?
Make the case.
Well, I mean, well, we already, before we hit this, we've already fully funded them. So this is throwing additional money into those stabilization funds, right? We
No,
have.
the only fully funded that you've done is stabilization up in A. The others are our annual contributions to like capital stabilization, debt exclusion stabilization, that allows you to do the capital plan, put money aside, get money to help the taxpayer. Those are the only contributions that we're making. So all those warrant articles that we have to put money in stabilizations, that's where it's coming from right there. There's no other place that it mentions this.
Is the case to move it up, the match, state match, free money?
Well, I mean,
Once you get past the 7.5, and you have a bucket of money to spend, you're gonna spend all the way down to capital. It's just the levels of the money that you have there. So if you have a bucket of $1 million, you're spending C through whatever to those percentages to spend the $1 million. So it's not like you're doing A and, you're not doing C and D and not doing E and F. You're doing them all. It's just the level that you're doing. Because there's a minimum attached to each one.
And what you're proposing with it is by adding the CPC, which wasn't in earlier, so now it's specifically highlighting it because we do get that match and what the
Right.
benefit of that
That's
is.
definitely a great idea.
It's
So
adjusting.
we did that, so in this budget session, we did fund CPC through free cash. We did it through D, other reserves.
yeah.
So it was part of that thing, now we're just calling it out as a
Mark,
separate.
what he's saying is it doesn't really matter what order they're in. What
It
matters
doesn't.
is the percentages you're funding in each of the
Right.
orders.
It's not full.
You can move them into whatever order you want, but if you're
The percentage
if
that's
you're
there
quibbling
dictates
over
what you
the,
do.
who gets how much out of each bucket,
Right.
you need to be quibbling on the percentages, not the order.
And Mark, that could be a live budget discussion.
So the CDE, C,
All the way down to the rest of the whole schedule,
Except the benchmark, which is out of place, but
just
yes.
the benchmark that's out of place.
Doesn't it say they should be funded in order?
that's where it's confusing.
Yeah.
It does say that, but it really doesn't matter.
So that's where it was
Eh,
confusing.
So
It says they're
maybe-
funding in
I mean, it
order, and then you
does.
take a percentage, so.
Maybe then you delete 4, right?
You're saying if we don't get up to 20, if we get past 10%, we don't have to get to 20% of C.
So instead of saying in the following order, you
As
say,
follows.
you say up to the percentages noted or something like that.
Yeah, as
We put
noted
in
below.
percentages.
Yeah, I mean, the order can get,
Yeah.
yeah. that's the point.
I agree with Mark's statement earlier. This is very difficult
Yeah.
to read and follow if you don't have the prior knowledge that perhaps you two do with this is how it's always been done and this is the way it works. If you two get hit by a bus, we'd have a hard time figuring out what this does. So I don't know. I mean, my recommendation would be,
I'll give it a shot of rewriting it.
yeah, have somebody, and it might, maybe it's not you that rewrites it because this makes sense to you, but it perhaps should be somebody else that has the knowledge and can write it. And maybe
You
we,
volunteer.
no, 'cause I don't, because that's, I'm not there yet.
No, that's fine.
So H, then, the additional capital projects kind of has to move up too, doesn't it? Because I'm just, if you add up these numbers, they don't add up to 100% then, right? OPEB, 20, up to 20, up to 50. Those numbers have to add up to 100 that you're funding, right? Or no more than 100, or we're saying we're leaving the excess above 7.5%? I'm just wondering how it works. If these aren't in priority order, should the numbers add up?
Is he saying you're gonna spend all the money? So you're spending all of $1 million, so you should add up to the 100, I think is
Yeah,
what
but
he's saying.
I think, so if I'd say, so if you take the pension at 20,
So
Then you-
the old numbers, pension was 20,
the 50%.
other reserves were 60, so that's 80.
Well, no, well,
Forget about
Forget-
the other thing
let me-
right now,
okay.
and capital was 20.
20.
Right.
So that's your 100%.
There's your 100, yeah.
So we took 10 away from the other reserves and put it to the CPC funds.
See, the additional capital on,
So it goes 20, 50, 10,
10,
20. And the only thing that could impact, maybe this is where the, in this order comes from, is if there are extraordinary deficits, it impacts capital and not the things above. We've never run into funding extraordinary deficits, because we generally account for that during the year.
so I'm just wondering if the F, G, and H move higher, right? The extraordinary, the additional capital things, if they're not part of your percentages, because if you, are we leaving room in there to fund those? Or is H really part of the original calculation?
Yes.
Using the 20% for capital, H,
Yep.
gets you to the 100%.
If
So
you
what we're
took the
saying,
if you took the.
so what we're saying is if there were extraordinary deficits, as you go in that order, if there were extraordinary deficits, it's impacting your capital and not those reserves
Right,
before.
but it only gets you there if you take the total, the highest amount, right? So if you decided to only take 20% from something, so like other reserve, it says up to 50 with a minimum of 20. So if you take 20, you don't add up to 100 anymore.
Right, it allows you to fund something else.
But it doesn't, because you can't fund any of these items because they have a cap, that the cap adds up to 100.
Okay.
The minimum
So
doesn't
then
have
we
to-
don't spend free cash.
So,
Right. You don't use it all.
The alternative is
And you're
you
leaving
leave
that
some
up.
on the table.
Right.
And
But-
maybe that's a strategy for when you think free cash is going to be impacted in the following years, and you want to spend something, but not everything. We never had minimums, and there was a committee that wanted the minimums put in.
But you can take a look and try to look at feedback.
Yeah, I'll try to rewrite it, but
So where does the money go if we don't spend it all?
free
Free
cash.
cash stays.
It stays in free cash.
Yep. So it basically.
Free cash is allowed to carry over year to year to year.
It's certified every year.
Free cash rules.
So part of next year's free cash is the 7.5% that we save
Okay.
to this calculation, so it carries year to year. That's our basis for next year. All right? We beat this one to death yet?
Well, it's 8:15, we're halfway through this thing.
Well,
Way to go!
one of the things that is also changed in this is stabilization. that's detailed in section 13A. So we go to section 13, and what I added was bullet number 2 in that. And it talks, this is general stabilization. Okay? We didn't make a stabilization transfer this year because we were above the 5% limit that we put in. And when I was rereading this, it's worded in a way, like if you look at number 3 now, withdrawals are used to mitigate an emergency. And it says in A and B on the next page, is that you really should only spend the amount over the 5%. So if we start saying we don't need something because we're at the 5% already, we're never going to be able to fund anything out of that account because we can't spend it. And then B says, when you really, come to a crunch time, you can spend up to 1/3 of that 5%. But you have to have a plan to replenish that over the next couple of years, 2 fiscal years. So I don't think that there should be, again, this is just me talking, I don't think there should be an instance where we're not funding stabilization, and I put a minimum of 100,000 there to come out of that, right off the top of free cash, to go in, to build up over that 5%. So if something does happen, we actually have money to spend, knowing that it still needs to go to town meeting to be appropriated.
Right.
Does that make sense to everyone? So there's 2 options here. We either put money in there even though we're over the 5%, or we change A and B on page 7, which says you can only spend that amount over the 5%, or in worst case, 1/3 of the balance. So maybe think about that, and next meeting we can talk it through if you'd like.
Can I say the second paragraph makes things confusing when you talk about the capital stabilization thing? Because I don't think you want to mix the two. Because you wanted stabilization to be 5%, but you don't really care so much what the balance of the capital stabilization is. And it kind of makes it sound like the capital stabilization counts as part of your 5%. I think you'd be better off not referring to capital stabilization at all here, unless you want to just call it a different account not covered by this section.
So this was probably written right at the time when we were advocating for the capital stabilization account to come into existence, where people wanted to use general stabilization for anything and everything to be spent on, and we wanted that separate account to be done. So this is one of the things, if it's something that was good years ago, it's not applicable now, we should take it out.
The way it's worded, it looks as if the capital and debt stabilization accounts count as part of your 5%, and I don't believe that's the intent.
No, it's saying that the capital stabilization account is the preferred method to fund capital, other than state general stabilization. That's what it was meant to say.
Yeah.
That's how I read it.
Yeah, this isn't, it's just stabilization period, it's not
Yeah.
capital.
It could be a footnote.
Let's use it for emergencies, basically. It can be what?
It could be a footnote, so that it's not,
Sure. That's a good
so that
idea.
it's taken out of the main text and not confusing.
Okay.
What's the balance of our stabilization fund now?
It's probably a little over 3 million right now.
Which is less than 5% of the operating budget?
No, it's, is it 3 million? A little bit more than 3 million, 3.5 million, maybe?
Yeah.
It's a little over 5%.
So a little over 5.
It's maybe 3.5, but, When you think about it, we're earning probably 4 to 5% of that money right now. So the interest that's going in is $1,000 a year, then and there, so.
Sure.
And that way, it's being built up nicely. So if we kept with the same thought process we had this year, we wouldn't fund it again. And
Right.
we're just shooting ourselves, I think, in the foot by doing that. Okay?
Okay.
Do we want to call it a night and go through this next time, set a next meeting, or do we want to keep plugging away? No.
Mary, come back again, come back with the revisions, talk about the revisions.
Are there any, just broadly, is there any other things that people had? Major changes that you saw that maybe we can incorporate into this draft?
You look at a small thing on section 22, item 9. So it says the town will continue its commitment to adequately fund the current facilities maintenance study and update the study as needed. So.
Yeah, that's kind of old, huh?
Right, so I just didn't know its relevance at this point. I mean, not that we shouldn't be looking at
How about
facilities.
How
at
about
this
the
point.
town will try and find a facilities manager
That's it.
Back in
to do a
2006.
facilities
Thanks for
study.
kicking a man while he's down. But, I mean, I think you could reword it, but like I just, but that specific reference. to
I
the-
get you. Again, it's,
Yeah.
it's when this was written.
No, I know, that's it, that
Right
was just
back up.
something that, right.
Just take it out.
Yeah, if we can eliminate that one.
Do we have any policies on reserve maximums? I feel like there's reserve budgets peppered throughout the town that, like, is there any way for us to come up with some sort of policy of transparency, or, you know, once you exceed X percent of your budget, you need to spend down before, you know, you'll get additional money from, like,
So the only general reserve, right, that's that stabilization account, is the one we just talked about. It's 5%, but we should put more in. If you think there should be a max to that, we should
3 million.
put it in here. But that's really the only one. The other ones,
Special purpose.
yeah, special purposes, capital stabilization. Things go in, we have the capital come in, we should have a plan to spend those monies down. Debt exclusion stabilization, we know what we need to do to fund to the same level for the taxpayer to keep that rates
Stable.
right? Stable. So we know what that number is, and we can fund to that level.
Senior state, we just moved.
Senior stabilization, we just got rid of. The school building stabilization
We
account.
just
just
established.
established.
And-
Yeah, we're not at any risk of
I
overfunding that.
don't think we're ever
Right,
gonna.
right. I think
Get
that's,
to that
I think I said,
point.
like, you wouldn't want to put the cap in if it, you'd only want to put the cap in if you were concerned about it being too much, and I don't think in any of these instances would be too much, you know.
Well, I think Karen's talking about, like, there's other, like, Park and Rec has their capital fund, right? The school has their reserve funds, right? We have all these reserve funds sitting out there that, you know, can grow indefinitely, effectively, right?
So, yes, Park and Rec has theirs, but that's, again, that's a separate board. And they should have a plan to spend their reserves down. If we think we should incorporate something in here, we need to get the commission involved in it and see what their plan is.
I mean, I wouldn't
And
wanna-
hold them to it
Yeah.
once it's in here. But the other ones that,
Say the school.
You mentioned the school ones, but,
so the school one
School
is
choice.
something that
Yeah.
I have on section 25. I added a Littleton School Department thing. And school choice was one of the things that I have in there. Whether there should be a policy, whether there should be some percentage that you don't spend down to, like Is it 5% of their budget? Is it 10% of their budget? What is that number? And from there, how do you spend that balance? To your point, how much is enough in that account? And the reason they keep that is because you always have that, chance that this school choice, not school choice, but special ed student is going to come in and break the bank. But how much is that potentially going to be? You can get 2 or 3 of those.
Right.
But what's that magic number? And that's something that you're going to have to guide us on. Again, we can't tell you how to spend your money.
Sure.
But we can certainly put suggestions in here as to how they should be managed and get the school committee to say, yes, we're going to operate under these guidelines, yes or no.
It makes sense to me. I mean, so I had never seen this document until this week. First time through, I liked it, and I was thinking, the school department, the school committee ought to have documents similar to this to guide our decision-making process that relates to the budget.
Like what types of things would you spend your school choice money? If it's a one-time revenue stream, should you really be spending salaries through it? Because you have an operational thing going for one-time funds.
Correct.
So what are the uses? Should there be a contribution out of school choice each year to go to the school building stabilization fund to build that up, to help pay
Now
for some
that's
of your
established, we
capital
could
things?
entertain that.
Right, I mean, it's those types of things that we should start thinking of.
Robert, it's 25 Juniper Road. Is it okay if I ask a question?
Sure.
So Karen's comment with regard to transparency really touches a nerve. And I see on your section 12, item E, proposal that you folks participate with regard to allocation of CPA funds, et cetera. And I want to expand with regard to the transparency in that a couple of meetings of CPC that I've attended, there's aspects that decisions are being made and requests are being made with regard to additional funding, and yet somebody's somewhat challenged or questioned as to, but doesn't that one of the 4 buckets of CPC already have $1 million fund balance? And then I watch and witness as numerous members establish that they don't really know exactly what the fund balances are at the moment, which leads my comment with regard to Karen's transparency comment. Do you have within this financial policy have a reach opportunity with regard to establishing that committees and organizations within Littleton that are outside of your direct, like you did with school, you can't make that decision for them, but do you have the ability to communicate to them, you should have, as part of your transparency to the public, an ongoing and consistent X times a year, we're disclosing to you residents what our existing balances are so that you can be informed and not basically be left in the dark with only those.
So Rob, can I try to take
insiders.
that? So two
Sure.
things. So, the percent of the CPC, right, they're their own committee, and they gotta do their homework and come in and check in with the finance team what those balances are. So that may have just been misinformation, I don't know, or not, if not misinformation, but just didn't have the information in hand at that time to be able to provide it. The balances you're talking about, if you look at our budget documents, all of those, we put those balances in the beginning. We've got, I don't know, I was proofreading the budget recently, it was like 20 pages of that kind of background. So it's there, but I think maybe your point is, how can we then, make that more available? And, so it's a good point. But, the information is there in terms of what we're providing. When we have the draft budget, it usually comes out at the beginning of, at the end of December. and goes out, it's there, those balances are there, but, and again, the thing you're talking about isn't necessarily a lack of transparency, but just honestly, just a matter of somebody just doing their homework before they get in that meeting.
And
It's a matter of communication too, because I think, and I've gone to a couple of CPC meetings this year myself, and I did find that some of the members were a little confused of what was going on. And I think there should be more guidance from both the Select Board and Finance Committee in joint meetings with the CPC to, number one, make sure they have policies in place on how they're going to spend these monies, and they have a plan in place. So the same things that I was asking the Affordable Housing Trust for this year, we should also be asking the CPC for those things, in my opinion. But the direction needs to come from the
Because I
select.
think somewhere, a different section, I can't refer to it now, you have some with regard to outstanding warrants that haven't been spent, and after a 3-year period, so that's the sort of thing with regard to Ryan, your point. One point in time is one part of transparency, but it's also accurate information at different points in time when dialogue and discussion with regard to funding, like when the action's happening during it, that would also be helpful. So I was trying to key on Karen's transparency with wondering whether your umbrella financial policy can have that reach, because I think that could be a helpful with regard to residents understanding and then rallying pro or con with regard to whatever the issue is. So thank you very much.
One of the things that we can certainly do very easily is on the town website, the open finance piece. We can make it so that there's a drop-down box for like questions, common questions. We can say, what are the balance of the CPC funds as one of those common questions, and up they'll pop. Current for tomorrow.
I don't need to prolong.
But
Thank you.
that's the type of things that we should be doing, that we may not be doing right now.
Yeah, that's
Whether
where it
it's
gets to Rob's point about, yeah,
CPC
that's
or
the
stabilization
Rob,
account balances,
Yeah.
any of those things, we should make it easy. And open finance on the town's website goes right into the general ledger and gives you up-to-the-date
Yeah. But
information.
the point's taken, Rob, though, to the extent that relaying about what open finance could provide and making sure that people know about that. So you've been having the conversation at this meeting, you knowing about this, us being able to, it's appreciated. So.
Okay, why don't we call it a night here on section 14. Out of that, we'll come up with some
Schedule the next meeting.
language on free cash, present that at the next thing. If anybody has any things that they'd like to add, maybe get them to me, and I can get them into the next draft. So we have one version of things. And maybe not send them out to everybody so we don't violate open meeting laws, but just get it to me and I can certainly put it into the document. Next meeting? What's good for everybody? What nights are good for everybody? Tuesday nights still good?
I'll have a conflict with Tuesday nights shortly. I'll have a bunch of conflicts, so we should just throw out some dates. We should just throw out some dates. Are we looking to meet every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, once a month?
I think maybe like one or, at least maybe 1-2 meetings.
2 more
They
meetings?
should be done.
Great.
And then it's getting it out to the boards and everything, and depending on how in-depth we want to go with the school stuff, that's what it is. And take a look at those
Edits.
bullet points that I have
Sure.
as far as the schools, and email me some suggestions and things.
I will.
Where you think we should be headed for that. That'll save some time.
So is the goal to have this buttoned up prior to
The budget
the
season.
budget message, which is normally in September?
September,
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got,
And it needs to go to our committee, it needs to go to the select
Right.
board, and the select
So-
board has a policy that they present it and wait to the next meeting, or 2 meetings or something.
So typically, that's their policy, is 2 meetings. yeah.
2 meetings, so it takes 2 meetings for them to go, so that's a month right there. So we should button our stuff up by July
Yep.
and get it out to the boards. FinCom needs to meet before July 15th to approve the
Yeah.
budget transfers.
Yeah, as well as anything else that we may have that the chief talked about, some potential transfers for vehicle repairs in the fire department.
So we'll have a meeting.
Another one in June and then July.
Let's try to
I,
get the
um,
June one first.
What works for you?
20th? It's next Thursday.
I think we have a Shaker Lane
No, on the 18th, we're doing it on the 18th.
18th, is that
Mhm.
okay? So,
Yeah, because
20th
Juneteenth
is
and the
good.
20th could make it,
And what
First
night-
try?
What night is that?
20th?
Same
What-
time?
I'm sorry.
The 20th.
20th
At
is.
6.
Is Gary
It's a
back
Thursday
yet?
at 6:30.
Gary's back this Thursday.
Okay.
All right, 20th,
20th, same time?
6:30,
That was easy.
same place.
How do you like driving the bus?
Yeah, 20th at 6:30.
We just have conflicts the following week, so.
Yeah, I'm gone the whole week.
Do we want to just look at one more out?
Yeah, if we
Might
can
be
do
easier.
that, then people can plan.
So I have conflicts the week of the 24th, and then we have the week of the 4th. So it might be tough. So the week of the 8th?
Probably, yeah.
I can do Monday through Wednesday of that week. And we may have FinCom that Tuesday.
Tuesday, probably FinCom.
I could do the 10th.
10th, July 10th?
10th, July 10th.
Mhm.
July 10th.
So Wednesday.
Yeah.
Steve, what are you saying for the date for FinCom?
Probably the 9th. Will you be ready with transfers by the 9th?
I think so.
9th.
July 9th?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, we should plan that around the select board meeting, though, right? Did the select board already approve it?
What, they,
Transfers?
the only thing is they already approved it, so I think it's only, you're the other party that needs to, yeah, so we just got to give them a record of what we're transferring. So, and
I
then
think
you would- but you have to
FinCom
vote,
would
but you-
want to see the.
Right, no, but you have to vote it yeah, you have to vote it separately, right?
So if we do it the 9th, it's due the 15th is
So
select board meeting.
you guys meet after that?
Let's see, I think we have on July, I think that's right, we just approved it, I think that's right. But I'd have to check it out, the schedule
Okay.
from.
If not, we may have
Yeah.
to switch ours to the
Okay,
second.
we can work that out later.
Okay.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
We have a motion to adjourn?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you very much.